Hello, everybody. I'm Martha McCallum. Welcome to the Untold Story podcast today. And I'm excited about talking to my next guest, who is Justin Shubow. He's the president of the Civic Art Society, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes the advancement of the classical tradition in public art and architecture. He's also the executive director of Rebuild Penn Station, a National Civic Art Society initiative, and he previously served as the chairman of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts after being appointed by President Trump in the first administration. He is also an author, a professor, and he joins me now. Welcome, Justin. It's great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So one of the things, I think there are so many interesting things happening as we look ahead to the second administration, the second Trump administration. And this is something that isn't going to, maybe at this point, get a lot of headlines, but I think it's something that people think about when they walk around the cities, the great cities of the United States that have seen so much decline over recent years. And not a lot of beauty has really sprung up as we look at a lot of our nation's really important cities. So tell me a little bit about what you hope to do if you get the opportunity in the next administration, and why you think it's important for people to understand the importance of classical architecture surrounding them in our nation's most historic cities.
Sure. So architecture is incredibly important. Whether or not we are consciously thinking about the buildings around us, they are influencing our thoughts and our feelings. A great building can uplift us, inspire us, make us feel that this is a world that is made for beings like us. By contrast, an ugly or dismal building can demoralize us. It can make us feel down. And the importance of architecture is all the more significant when it comes to our government buildings, since these buildings are symbolic. They speak to who we are and who we wish to be. We want great federal buildings that inspire, that ennoble the United States and make us better citizens.
There has been a battle going on in architecture over modernism and classic architecture. There are even political connotations that are attached to this, which I think is, I understand the modernist desire to sort of break norms and do something that is different in terms of the aesthetic of a building. But explain what most people don't really think much about, this kind of political divide between classical architecture proponents and modernists.
Well, I don't think there's a divide among ordinary Americans. I think the vast majority of people prefer classical and traditional designs for public buildings. In fact, my organization did a survey by the Harris Poll in 2020, finding that 72% of the people surveyed preferred classical and traditional architecture for federal buildings. There were widespread majorities across every demographic group, gender, race, socioeconomic, and political party affiliation, with 73% of Republicans preferring tradition and 70% of Democrats. The real political divide is found in our elites. So the architectural elites, many of them, do not wish to look to the past. They don't want to build in styles that they think should be purely historic, that should not be used today. And as another example of elite opposition to classical architecture, President Trump amazingly issued a revolutionary executive order at the end of his term that reoriented federal architecture from modernism to classical and traditional design. And the New York Times published an editorial, a screed against the executive order titled, "What's So Great About Fake Roman Temples?" The Times just couldn't stand the idea that we could build in such a manner today. They said, you know, the founding fathers who initiated this long tradition of classical architecture in the United States, well, they had to borrow clothes. You know, they didn't have any other sources for architecture, but we don't need to do that today. But if you believe the New York Times that there is something wrong with quote unquote fake Roman temples, then that means that the U.S. Capitol is fake. It means that the Jefferson Memorial is fake. I mean, these are buildings based on ancient Roman models, but they're obviously not 2,000 years old. And I think there's nothing wrong with building in that sort of traditional style that is beloved by so many people.
Yeah. It makes me think, Americans love to go to Europe and look at the great palaces and examples of architecture. Many of those are also based on ancient Greek and Roman temples. So those are not, I don't think anyone would consider those buildings to be fake examples of architecture. Do you?
No, absolutely not. Classical architecture is alive and flourishing today. There are capable architects out there who are able of designing buildings as great as the ones that ennoble Washington, D.C. I mean, if you ask Americans, many of them love the design of the Capitol, the White House, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial. These are iconic symbols of our nation, and it makes perfect sense that we continue to build within that tradition. And President Trump has just been truly visionary on this. He said in his 2023 speech at CPAC that he will get rid of bad and ugly buildings and build in the classical style of Western civilization.
So one of the things that sometimes I see on Instagram, I think it's called Culture Critic, they talk about the difference between, why don't we build things that are beautiful? They'll show examples of museums in Florence, sculptures of Renaissance art, and then they look at things that are built today, modern paintings, modern sculpture, and argue that these things are not beautiful. Obviously, art is in the eye of the artist and of the beholder. Some people would find these contemporary examples very beautiful. But when we sort of point to things in our culture and say, look at this beautiful piece of art, it's usually really, really old, Justin.
I don't know if that is true. I mean, what do you mean by really, really old? I mean, the Jefferson Memorial, which I mentioned, was completed in the 1940s. The Supreme Court was completed in the 1930s. These are not ancient buildings, and yet they are widely embraced by the American people. And, you said that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But I think when you look at certain buildings, they are widely appreciated by everybody. There's no debate, I think, that the Supreme Court is not a great building. There's no debate about the Taj Mahal. There is some kind of human nature that we all share, and certain buildings tap into that particular love of beauty. You will also find certain modernist architects explicitly rejecting beauty as a criterion. It's not that they're disagreeing about what is beautiful. They think that buildings should achieve other things, the honesty of the materials, the strikingness of form. There are all sorts of things that they are seeking, but not beauty.
So, I think of Frank Lloyd Wright and Falling Water. You think of some contemporary pieces that are designed to reflect the nature around them. Do you think those are beautiful?
Sure, I appreciate some of Frank Lloyd Wright's houses. And, there is, I'm not a fundamentalist saying that the only way to build new, beautiful buildings is through the classical tradition. But there is a grand tradition found in all civilizations that I like to call the architecture of humanism. The three criteria for for judging a building within that tradition come from an ancient Roman architect named Vitruvius. And he said the three criteria are commodity, firmness, and delight. Commodity, meaning that a building suits its purpose. Firmness, the building is solid and appears solid. And delight, the building is beautiful. Any architecture that satisfies those three criteria is worthy architecture.
So I know you're being considered to head the National Endowment for the Arts in the second Trump administration. When do you think you will know whether or not you've been chosen for that position?
Well, I wouldn't be presumptuous about serving in any role in the administration, but it would absolutely be a true honor to serve. I'm not sure what the timeline is, but it's important to understand that the National Endowment for the Arts is the largest funder of arts and arts education in this country. Its budget is around $200 million a year. Now, admittedly, Republicans for many years have called for defunding the agency. But I think that it's because they don't see that it's producing great art. My motto for how I would run the endowment comes from Dana Gioia, a masterful poet and translator who ran the NEA under George W. Bush's administration. He said, "A great nation deserves great art." I believe that the NEA needs a major change and needs to foster art that ennobles and enhances the United States' prestige.
So what would a second Trump administration look like in terms of projects that we might see happen around the 250th anniversary of the country that would honor and reflect President Trump's desire to bring classic architecture back into focus and for the future of the country?
Well, I think if there's a general theme, it is make America beautiful again. President Trump is a builder. He recognizes the importance of buildings. Like all great statesmen have understood that public buildings shape the body politic. And the word beauty is coming out across his administration. I'd be shocked, for instance, if Trump did not reissue his executive order on federal architecture. Unfortunately, Biden rescinded that order almost immediately after taking office. I think Trump will reissue it. Plus, he's also talked about beauty even regarding infrastructure. In the announcement of Sean Duffy for Secretary of Transportation, it said that Duffy will prioritize excellence, competence, and so on, but also beauty in our airports and other infrastructure. To me, this is incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
There is an opportunity in New York City for the need for a new Pennsylvania station. It's the busiest transportation depot in the Western Hemisphere, yet it's a dank and depressing underground warren. President Trump had a phone call with New York's Governor Hochul immediately after the election, saying that he wanted to make Penn Station beautiful again. The original Penn Station, which was completed in 1910, was a magnificent classical design that was based on ancient Roman baths. The current design is one of the worst places in America. There was a famous architecture critic who talked about Penn Station saying, "One used to enter the city like a god, now you scuttle in like a rat." I think President Trump, paying attention to beauty, might see that we could build a new classical Penn Station in New York. And this is not just a train station. We're talking about something that would have symbolic impact on American civilization in the same way that in France, the reconstruction of Notre Dame was significant for their country.
The Untold Story continues right after this.
I think it's a fantastic point. I mean, you look at, and I think there's an exhibit in the Moynihan Annex to Penn Station that is about the old Penn Station. And people protested in 1963 or 4, I believe it was, the tearing down of Penn Station in order to build the current Penn Station and Madison Square Garden, which is, although there's no better place to see a basketball game or a hockey game or a concert. It is not an attractive building at all. So what would happen in this vision to Madison Square Garden, and what would be the time frame on rebuilding this, and how realistic is this dream?
Well, it is realistic. Madison Square Garden is one of the oldest sports arenas in the United States. It's not very functional. The owners of the garden could make a lot more money by building a new sports arena, perhaps just across the street to the east from Penn Station, where they would still have all the access to the transportation infrastructure, but be able to build a modern facility that people who visit would greatly enjoy. It makes no sense that there's a sports arena sitting over a train station that is used by 650,000 people a year. The station itself is dangerous. There's a lack of light. There's a lack of air. So we do need major change to happen. As for when it will happen, I mean, obviously, the sooner the better. This is a major project. It will take a while to, build a new Madison Square Garden, to, fix the infrastructure on the tracks and do all the work that needs to be done on the station. But what we would love to see, and I think all New Yorkers and indeed all Americans would love to see, is a Penn Station that is as grand as Grand Central Terminal, which, many people might know is one of the best buildings in America.
Yes. And Grand Central Terminal still has the original doorways and archways all around the outside. Jackie Kennedy worked to save Grand Central after Penn Station was demolished. It became an even more passionate project for her to try to help be on the team that saved Grand Central Station, which also was going to be replaced with sort of a boxy contemporary building over it. But I'm wondering, just in terms of the politics and the reaction in New York, when I'm listening to what you're talking about, Justin, in terms of where exactly would you move Madison Square Garden to?
So one potential site is that of that used to house the Hotel Pennsylvania. It's
Yes.
So Penn Station
Across
goes
the street.
between 7th Avenue and 8th Avenue. This site is just to the east of 7th Avenue. And there is absolutely space there. And yes, there might need to be the demolition of some buildings, but I have seen a proposal that shows how Madison Square Garden could absolutely fit there. I am glad that you mentioned Jackie Kennedy's role in saving Grand Central Terminal, since this is, it is interesting to see how first ladies in American history have taken an interest in historic preservation. So when Jackie Kennedy was first lady, her biggest success, I think, was saving Lafayette Square from destruction. This is a square just next to the White House, full of historic, beautiful buildings, yet the plan was to tear them down and replace them with, ugly, terrible, modernist buildings. But she single-handedly saved Lafayette Square. And also, Lady Bird Johnson was heavily involved in historic preservation. In fact, when President Johnson sent the National Historic Preservation Act to Congress, he included a note saying Lady Bird wants it. So it's great to see how first ladies...
Do you think Melania Trump wants to save Penn Station?
Well, I'm not sure about Penn Station, but Mrs. Trump did amazing work on the White House, building a fantastic new tennis pavilion. She even designed custom rugs for the residents. So she was a wonderful steward and preservationist for the White House. And so I think that demonstrates her interest in historic preservation.
So I have to ask you what you think of Trump Tower as a building in Manhattan in terms of the architecture.
Well, Trump Tower, represents a kind of glitz of its time period. And perhaps that was the right architecture for, luxury shopping, for luxury residences. And you can't argue with success. I mean, Trump Tower is a building famous throughout the United States. And, I'm not saying there isn't a place for modernism here and there. And that is, I think, absolutely appropriate.
So your focus, obviously, if you are overseeing the NEA, would be federal buildings, obviously, and using the federal budget for the National Endowment for the Arts, $200 million in that neighborhood, to spearhead these projects. What would we see that might happen in Washington, D.C. in your vision?
Well, I'm not saying that the NEA can be directly responsible for the design of new buildings, but certainly there could be an initiative celebrating and fostering the great tradition of American civic architecture that goes back to the founding fathers. Everything from the classical temple design of the Virginia Capitol by Thomas Jefferson. Both Jefferson and Washington, as you may know, were talented amateur architects, and Jefferson himself was an actual genius. And both founding fathers were directly involved with the design of the White House and Capitol. they inaugurated a classical tradition that lasted in federal buildings for about 150 years. And that great tradition of civic architecture included to cover things like Penn Station in New York. And the NEA certainly could celebrate that tradition.
Absolutely. I've heard you discuss this whole issue of classical architecture being white supremacist or even fascist, according to some of its critics. Explain that debate to our listeners.
Well, I'm not claiming that it's white supremacist, but certainly there are certain opponents, such as professors of architecture, who will claim that classical architecture is white supremacist or it's racist. So, for instance, they'll say segregation was upheld in the South in classical courthouses. But at the same time, it was classical federal courthouses that put out rulings that overturned segregation. And also say, look at the architecture of historically black colleges in the United States. Lo and behold, so many of their buildings are wonderful classical designs.
Yes, beautiful
in
classical
fact,
designs.
Howard University here in Washington, D.C., their logo is of a classical building. And I think if you ask African Americans, when you look at the U.S. Supreme Court, do you see a racist building? I think they would say, what the heck are you talking about? That's not how people perceive that building whatsoever.
No, I don't think so. Just last question, Justin. How did you come to this work? I read that you studied philosophy, but it doesn't look like you're an artist by background or an architect. Are you?
No, I'm just a layman with strong opinions.
All right. Well, it's really a pleasure to talk to you, Justin Shubow, and we look forward to seeing what happens with this. I think there are a lot of exciting plans around America 250, and you want to see a rebirth of beautiful art in this country that surrounds it. So we're excited to see where all of this goes. Justin, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Martha McCallum. That's the Untold Story for today. Join us next time. You've been listening to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Make sure to rate and review. For more podcasts, go to foxnewspodcast.com. Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.